Are you developing an API in Laravel 11 and looking for the best way to authenticate users securely? Do you need to protect your API routes with OAuth 2.0 and issue secure access tokens? Or maybe you are confused about whether to use Laravel Passport or Sanctum for your authentication needs? In this video, we are diving deep into Laravel Passport, the go-to solution for full OAuth 2.0 authentication in Laravel applications. I will walk you through the entire process from understanding how OAuth works to implementing Passport for secure token-based authentication in your REST API. We will start by breaking down OAuth 2.0 and why it is the industry standard for API authentication. Then we will install and configure Laravel Passport, and we will build a real-world to-do application API with full CRUD operations and secured routes. But that's not all. We have also covered Laravel Sanctum authentication in our Laravel REST API playlist, where we implemented lightweight authentication for single-page applications and mobile applications. So if you are wondering when to use Passport versus Sanctum, this video will clear it up. And by the end of this tutorial, you will not only understand how Passport works, but you will have a fully functional, secure API with authentication, access tokens, and best practices for API security. So if you are ready to level up your Laravel API security, let's dive right in. So here is the outline of this video. Firstly, we will start with what is API authentication and why we will choose Passport. Then we will see the difference between OAuth and OAuth 2.0. Also, we will see the comparison between Passport and Sanctum. And then we will start by installing Laravel Passport in Laravel application. Further, we will understand OAuth 2.0 grant types in Passport. And then we will set up that authentication with Passport in Laravel application. And next we will create a secure REST API with Passport. And also we will build a to-do application API to manage the CRUD operations. And lastly, we will see best practices for API security. So let's start with what is API authentication. So the API authentication is a security process that ensures only authorized users or applications can access certain resources. Unlike traditional authentication, where sessions and cookies are used in the server side, and the API authentication relies on tokens such as OAuth token or API keys. This is essential for securing APIs, preventing unauthorized access, and maintaining data integrating in web and mobile applications. Next, we will talk about why use Laravel Passport. So the Laravel Passport provides a seamless way to implement OAuth 2.0 authentication in Laravel applications. And this generates access tokens, handles authentication requests, and ensures secure communication between clients and servers. This is especially useful for large applications where multiple clients, just like mobile application and front-end frameworks, need to authenticate against the same backend. Now we will talk about OAuth because we have used this OAuth terms multiple times regarding API security. So the OAuth is an open standard authorization, and this is a framework that allows application to access user data securely without requiring the user to share their password. So instead of logging in with credentials, just like username and password, OAuth provides a secure method for third-party applications to request permission from a user and access specific resources using access tokens. So the popular services like Google, Facebook, and GitHub use OAuth to let users log in securely. And for managing the authentication securely, this uses tokens. Okay. Now we will see what is OAuth 2.0. So the OAuth 2.0 is the modern version of OAuth, and this provides a more flexible, scalable, and secure authentication process than OAuth. And it issues access tokens to authenticate API requests. And also this eliminates the need for credential in every request. That means when you make API request, you don't need to submit the credentials like username and password. Instead, this will handle it through the access tokens. So OAuth 2.0 introduces different grant types just like password grant, authorization code, and client credentials. And this makes it suitable for different authentication scenarios. And also it supports refresh tokens and this allows user to stay logged in without repeatedly entering their credentials. So if you have to maintain this session for the long time, then this provides the refresh token options. So in a few interval of times, we can refresh the user session based on this refresh token. Now we will talk about the key differences between OAuth and OAuth 2.0. So OAuth 2.0 is a major improvement over OAuth, and this makes authentication easier, faster and more secure. So unlike OAuth, which relies on cryptographic signatures, OAuth 2.0 uses SSL or TLS encryption, and this allows developers to choose the best authentication flow for their applications. The refresh token mechanism in OAuth 2.0 ensures that users stay authenticated without frequent logins. So internally this will refresh the user authentication session based on the refresh token. Now we will see why OAuth 2.0 for Laravel Passport. So Laravel Passport implements OAuth 2.0 to offer a secure and flexible authentication system. And this provides access tokens to users, which ensures secure communication between clients and servers. And with multiple grant types, this allows different authentication mechanism, just like password-based login, authorization code flow, and client credentials. Since OAuth 2.0 enforces SSL encryption, that's why this guarantees secure token exchange and protecting sensitive user data. Now we will talk about the difference between Passport versus Sanctum, because previously we created a REST API using this Sanctum, and currently in Laravel, Sanctum is the default authentication mechanism for the REST APIs. So it is needed to know the key differences between Passport versus Sanctum. So the Laravel Passport is a full-fledged OAuth 2.0 implementation, and this makes it ideal for projects which require multiple client authentication. And this supports access token and refresh tokens, which are useful for handling authentication across different devices. Now on the other hand, the Sanctum is a lightweight alternative that provides API token authentication without the complexities of OAuth, and it is best suited for single page applications and mobile applications that won't need full OAuth capabilities. I hope the differences are clear for you. Now we will see how OAuth 2.0 works in Laravel Passport. So OAuth 2.0 is the industry standard for secure API authentication, and instead of sending usernames and passwords with each request, OAuth 2.0 issues tokens that verify user identity from the database, and these tokens have an expiration time and can be refreshed when it is needed. So Laravel Passport implements this system, and it allows application to authenticate users securely while following modern security best practices. Now we will talk about API authentication flow with Passport in Laravel. So when a user's login, the API validates the credentials and issues an access token. This token is then used to authenticate all future API requests. And also these tokens have an expiration time, and Laravel Passport also supports refresh tokens to get new access token without requiring the user to log in again. So this is how API authentication flow works in Laravel. Now we will quickly come to the terminal, and we will set up the Laravel application to create REST API using the Passport authentication. So I have quickly navigated to the terminal, and I will create a fresh Laravel 11 application using Laravel installer. So I will type Laravel new, and I will provide the application name. Here we are going to create a REST API for the to-do application with the authentication. That's why I will provide the application name as to-do app API. I will hit enter. And for the REST API, we don't need any starter kit, so I will go with no starter kit. And regarding the testing framework, I will go with paste, and this is installing Laravel 11 application. Now regarding the database, I will go with SQLite itself, and as of now I don't want to run the default migration, so I will select no. Yes, and the installation has been done. Now I will quickly navigate to the project folder. I will open this in the VS Code editor. Yes, the project has been opened in the VS Code editor. Now in the next step, we will install Laravel Passport. So I will quickly navigate to the Laravel official documentation. Okay, here we have the Laravel Passport section. Firstly, we have the introduction section for Passport or Sanctum. So we already discussed about the Passport and Sanctum here. Now we'll navigate to this installation step. And for installing the Passport, either we can go with install API command, or we can directly install it using the composer require Laravel Passport command. Because Laravel 11 does not provide the API routes by default, and therefore we need to install the API route. So whenever you will install the API route, that time we can specify either we need to install Passport or Sanctum. Okay, so it is up to you. If your API route setup has been done before, then you can install the Passport additionally using the composer command. Else, if it is the fresh setup, then we can install the Passport along with this API route. So in the current scenario, we have the fresh application of Laravel 11 and we don't have the API routes added inside this. So I'll be going with this install API command. So I will quickly copy this command. I will paste in the terminal and I will hit enter. So this is installing Laravel Passport along with this API route. Here it asked, would you like to use UUID for all client IDs? I will select yes. So the API scaffolding has been installed. Now we can use this has API token straight in user model. Now I will jump to the code editor. Here we have the API route installed, and if we'll check the composer.json file first, here it has added Laravel Passport. Now we will navigate to the user model, and here I will import that trait has API token. So we will add that here in the use section. API tokens. This has imported from Laravel Passport. Okay. Now we will navigate to the documentation again and we will follow the next step. So after installation, we have added this has API token trait in user model. So this trait will provide a few helper methods in order to manage the API tokens. Now in the next step, we will have to navigate to the config auth.php and we will have to add the drivers as Passport for managing the API. So we'll navigate to the config auth.php. If we'll scroll down under the guard section, we will have to add one guard for the API. Inside this, we will have to add the driver as Passport and the provider will be users, because we are going to manage the API tokens for the users. Now let's check out the documentation again. And we will have to run this PHP addition passport keys command. So let's copy this command. Let's navigate to the terminal and let's add this command. Let's hit enter. And this said encryption keys already exist. So this has added the encryption key by default when we installed Laravel Passport using the API route. So if we'll check out the database, database.sqlite, here the Passport has added a couple of tables just like OAuth access tokens, OAuth auth codes, OAuth clients, and here this has added the OAuth client just like Laravel password grant client and personal access client. Okay, and also this has added the personal access clients table. Inside this has added a default client ID, and we have the OAuth refresh tokens table. So the client ID has been created inside the database. Now if we'll come to the config, here this has added the passport.php. Inside this has added passport guard. We have the encryption keys as private and public key. This is the connection, client UID and personal access client. So we don't have to configure anything inside this passport.php file. Let's close this. Okay. Now we will create a controller in order to create authentication API for users. So I'll quickly come to the terminal I'll clear this, and I will create one controller as make controller, and I just want to create this controller inside one folder as auth. Inside this I will create auth controller. Yes, the auth controller has been created inside auth folder. Alright. Now firstly I will create one function as register, because we have to register users. Then we will generate the API tokens for those users. So I will provide the function name as register. Okay. And inside this function I will just capture the request just like this. And here I will just give the annotation function register, and this will accept the parameter as illuminate HTTP request, and we have its object. I will add dump and die request all, just in order to check are we able to make API call. And for calling this function we will have to create one route inside api.php. So we'll navigate to routes api.php, and here I will create one get route just like this. And better I can just create one route controller group, because we are going to create a couple of routes related to this authentication controller. So I will add auth controller class, and I will use this group function, and inside this anonymous function I will add this route, and here I will just pass the endpoint name just like register. And also I just want to add one route prefix for these authentication routes. So just before this route I will add route prefix. Inside the prefix I will just add the prefix name just like auth, and here I will just use group function. Okay. Now inside this auth prefix I will move this register route, and we will have to change this route method to post, because we are going to register a user, and this will trigger the register function defined inside the auth controller, this one. Okay. And let's add route name as register, and for this auth prefix group I will add name as auth dot. So this will generate the route name as auth.register, and the route endpoint will be auth/register. If we'll come to the terminal, and here I will show you PHP artisan route colon list. Yes, in the route list the route endpoint is API/auth/register, and the name is auth/register. So in the REST API, Laravel adds route prefix as API default in every routes. Now we will be able to access this route endpoint in the Postman. So for testing the API endpoint I will be using Postman tool. So here I have the Postman. I will make the API request here. So our Laravel application name is todo-app-api. So I will type http://todo-app-api.test, and I will add prefix as API. Thereafter we have the prefix as auth as per this route list. Okay. So we have to add API/auth/register. Let's click on send, and let's navigate to this preview tab. Here we are getting empty array because we have not passed any form data from this request. So we are able to make the API request in our application. So let's come to the code, and here let's continue this register functionality. So firstly we will have to add the form validation, right? So what I will do for the validation, I will create a separate form request here, because I just want to keep our code base as much cleaner, and we will follow the service and repository design pattern as well. Okay, so that our controller code will be very clean. So I will quickly come to the terminal, and here I'll just create form request for the register. So I will write PHP addition :request, and here I will just pass the request name as auth register. Let's hit enter. Yes, auth register request has been created. Now let's navigate to the app, HTTP request. We have the auth register request. Inside this, firstly we will have to authorize this request. So we will make this to true. Inside the rules, I will define a validation rule for the field like name, because we have the migrations added as the name, email and password, right? So I will add required. Next we will add it for email. This will be required email, and it should be unique from users table email field. Okay. Next I will add password. So this will be required, and it should accept alphanumeric only. And I will set min 5, max 20. Okay. For the name, I will add min as 5. So this is the basic validation rules for the name, email and password fields. Now I will come to the auth controller, and instead of eliminate HTTP request, I will inject auth register request. So the auth register request has been imported here. I will change this namespace as app HTTP requests auth register. This is done. Now let's quickly check the validation. So I'll come to the Postman again, and here without passing the form input data, I'll just make the API request. So we can see this has redirected on the Laravel homepage. That means the validation rules are working properly, but here we are not able to see the validation error messages. So firstly we will have to work on this validation error messages. So I will come to the auth register class itself, and inside this I will just override Laravel function failed validation. Okay. So I will create one function as protected function failed validation. So this function is Laravel built-in function, and here I'm just overriding this function. So this function accepts validator parameter, and this is imported from validation contracts. Okay. And based on this, we will be getting the validation error messages. Okay. I'll come to the Postman tool. If I will hit enter, here we are getting the validation errors. So we have to throw the exception here. These are the validation error messages. So let's display this error messages here by throwing the exception. So I will write throw new HTTP response exception. Inside this, we will have to return the response in the JSON format, and I will just pass success as false, and I will set message validation failed, and I will display errors from this validator errors function just like this. And here we can pass the status code just like 422. This will be for validation error. So this is accepting parameter as validator, and this will return the exception. Now if we'll come to the Postman tool again, if we'll try to hit this API request, yes, now we are able to get the validation error messages here. Now let's try to submit the API request by adding these fields. So I'll come to the body, and here I'll select form data, and let's specify name. I will provide the name here. Next we have the email, so I will add example.com, and next password I will set it as 1 2 3 4 5. Now if we'll submit the request, in the preview Yes, we are able to dump that request. Now let's come to the code editor. So we have handled the validation error messages using this form request here. Now we will proceed for the business logic and for the insert operation. So for writing the business logic, I will be using service class, and for the database operation things, I will be using the repository class. So overall, we are going to follow the repository design pattern here. So let's create a service class first. I'll come to the terminal. Here I will type php artisan make class. Okay, and I'm just going to create a new directory as services. Inside this, I will be creating auth service class. So the auth service class has been created here. Inside app, we have the services, and there we have the auth service class. So inside the auth service class, I will create a function as auth register. Inside this function, we will have to capture the request data, and that we will receive in the form of array. So I will add dump and die request, and I'll come to the controller, and firstly I'll create one constructor here. Now inside the constructor, I will inject that auth service class. So I will write auth service. I will create its instance as auth service. Now in order to access this instance outside this constructor, we will have to assign this to a variable. So I will just create a variable as protected auth service, and inside this constructor, I will assign this to variable as auth service. Now based on this instance, I will call that function name as auth register. Now inside this function, I will pass this validated request, and here I will just wrap in try catch block. And let's call this function inside the try block, and in the catch block, I will dump the log error exception occurred while registering user, and I will append exception message here. This is done. Let's import this log facade. Now we will be receiving the form request data inside the auth service. So from here, we will just map the data, and then we will pass this data to the repository class. So we need a repository class here. So I'll create one more class as repository make class as repository auth repository. Let's hit enter. Yes, auth repository has been created. So inside the auth service constructor, I will inject that auth repository. I will create its instance. Again, we will have to create one protected variable here, protected auth repository, and inside the constructor, let's assign this to auth repository variable. Okay, this is done. Let me add one comment here. This is auth register function. This is form request. Okay. Now let's map the form data here that we are going to insert to the users table. So here, before saving the data into the database, we have to do some customization in the password data, because we have to encrypt the password before sending this to the database. So firstly, I will just capture the request data here. So what I will do, I will just write request all, okay, and I will just capture all the request data into this variable, because this will be coming in the form of array. If we'll check to the postman, previously we were getting this data in the array format. So here we will assign this request password is equals to encrypted password. So I will be using hash make function. Let's import this, and inside this make function I will pass request password, just like this. Alright, now if we'll put dump and die request only, because we have already captured the request all data into this request variable, and if we'll come to the postman and if we'll resend the API request, yes, we are getting the encrypted password here. Now we will send this data to the repository class. So simply I'll just copy this repository instance, and here I'll just define one function as register user, and let's come to the repository class, and here I'll define the function register user, and let's capture the user request, and here I'll just call user model create function. Inside this create function I will simply pass this user request, and let's import this, and here I'll simply return. Okay, function register user, this is parameter user request, and this will return the user. Now let's capture this response in the auth service. So from here I will return this to the controller back, register user, and in the controller here we will have to capture the response, and from here we will have to return this response in the form of JSON. So we will have to return the response for the multiple functions. So better we can create a common function for returning all the responses like success or error, and that we can reuse it in multiple functions. So for this again I'll create a common class. So let's quickly navigate to the terminal, and I will create one helper class using make class command, and this I want to create inside helper folder, and here I'll provide the class name just like API response. So inside the helper we have the API response class created. Now inside this I will create a function just like public function success. Inside this function I will capture few parameters just like status, and by default I will set this to success. Next I will capture message, this will be null. Let me dock this, and I will capture data, this will be by default empty array, and also I will just pass the status code, this will be 200 by default. Now inside this success function I will simply return response JSON. Okay, and here I'll just create one array. Inside this array I will just pass status, and this I will capture it from here. Next we will have message, and this will be $message data, and the status code, this will be added here. And let's terminate this, and better we can just set this function to static so that this function can be called easily. This is our success function, and this is capturing the parameter just like status, message, data, and the status code, and this is returning illuminate HTTP JSON response. And same thing we will have to add it for error. So I will just create one separate function for the error. If you want, we can define that in the same function by specifying the type as success or error, but as of now I'll just keep the error function as separate error. In the error we don't need the data, and this status code will be 500. I'll remove this. Okay, this is done. Now I will come to the auth controller, and here I'll just add one condition. If we have response, that means if user is registered, then I'll call the API response colon success function. Okay, because we have defined the function to static, so we can call directly using the class name. Now inside this we will have to pass the parameter. So in the first parameter we have the status. If you don't want to pass the status as a static, for this as well we can create one variable. So what I will do, I'll come to the base controller. So I will define public const, and here I'll just define message as success message, and I will just specify message as request processed successfully. For the failed message, as unable to process the request. Please try again. And also I'll create a constant just like status is equals to success, or better we can define success status and error status, just like this. This will be for reusability purpose only. Okay. Now inside the auth controller, instead of this static status, I will just call self colon success status. Next we have to pass the message in the API response. So I will just pass message self colon success message, and then we will have to pass the data and the status code. Okay, so let's pass one by one. Data, I just want to return the response, and regarding the status code, we can define the status code inside the controller itself. Public const success will be 200, error will be 500, and we can define validation error as well. Public const validation error. However, it is not needed because validation error has been already captured inside the form request class. Okay, but let's keep it there. So these are the status code, these are the status keyword, and these are the messages. Okay, this is done. Now let's complete this. So after the data, we have to pass the status code. So let's pass status code as self colon success. This is done. Now the same thing we will have to pass it for the error. So simply I'll just duplicate this line, and here I'll call it for the error message. So instead of this success status, I will call the error status. Data is not needed, I'll remove this. Message will be failed message, and this status code will be error. This is done, and we will have to return it. Same thing we will add it for the exception, and I will add one more status for the error. So for this I'll just define message as exception, and we will define exception occurred. Please try again. And this message I'll be using as exception message. So I'll copy this message and I will add it here. Okay, this is done. Now let's come to the Postman tool, and let's try to register this user. I'll click on send. Yes, we received the success message here, and the user is registered successfully. If we'll try to register this user again, this will throw the error for the unique email address. Okay, the email has been already taken. If you'll come to the database, yes, inside the users table, one user has been registered here. Similarly, we can register more users. So now next we will be working on the login functionality. So I'll create one more function for the login. Okay, this will be login, and for the login again I will create one more request because we have to validate the email and password. So I'll come to the terminal again and I will create one more class. This will be form request. So we will create another form request as auth login. I'll come to the class. Inside app http request, we have the auth login request. Again, let's return this authorized to true, and in the validation rules I will add it for email required, and it should be email only. Password, this will be required. Okay, and again for the failed validation I will return one more function. So I'll simply copy it from author register and I will paste it here. This will be failed validation. Now let's import this validator facade using this eliminate contract validation and also this exception clause. Okay, this is done. Now let's come to the auth controller, and here let's import that form request. So I will add auth login and I will just create request. Now I will add try catch block again. This will accept parameter as app http requests auth login request, and this will return eliminate http JSON response. Let's copy it and add it for above functions. This is done. Now from this login function again I'll call the service. So I will write $this auth service user login, and here I'll just pass the request data. Now we will have to define this function inside the auth service. So after this function, let's define it user login. Let's add these comments. Okay, and here let's capture this request. Now inside this function we will have to validate the user credentials for the authentication. So for the authentication I will be using auth facade here. So inside the auth I will be using attempt function. So this attempt function will take parameters in the form of array, and here we will have to check for the email and password. So this email will come from this request email, and in the next parameter we will have to pass the password, and again this will come from the request password array. Okay, I will simply add dump and die just to see whether it is returning true or false. Now based on this function I'll define one route inside api.php. So I'll simply duplicate this route. I will change this function name to login and endpoint name as login. Okay, auth routes. I'll come to the postman now. I'll copy this URL. I'll open it in a new tab. I will change this post, and this route endpoint name will be login. Let's click on send. Yes, this returned the validation error messages. Now I'll come to the body form data, and here I will just pass email, and I will simply add the same email address here, and regarding the password I'll copy it from here. Okay, I'll click on send and this returned true. Okay, now if we'll just change the password and if we'll click on send, this has returned false, means this user is not authenticated. So based on this, I will add the condition inside the service class. Here I'll add if this is authenticated, okay, or better I'll add if not authenticated. Then from here I will return false. Now next, if the user is authenticated, then I will be using auth facade user function here, and I will capture it in a variable just like auth user, and simply I'll add dump and die auth user here just to check are we able to get the authenticated user data here. Let's check out now. This has returned false because of this invalid credential. Now I will correct the password and I'll send it again. Yes, we are getting the user data here. Okay, I'll come to the code editor again, and from here I will generate the token for this authenticated user. So I will add auth user create token function. Inside this I will pass one passphrase as just like token, and here I will specify the token type as access token. Okay, and I will assign this to a variable just like token, and from here I will return the data. So I will create one array data here just like user. Inside this I will create data just like email, and this will come from the auth user email, and I will just pass the token. Alright, and here I will return this user data, or better we can simply return like this. This is done. Now let's capture this response in the controller. So I'll come to the auth controller, and here I will check login response, and firstly I will add if not login response. That means if credentials are not matched, then we will have to throw invalid password error message. So I will simply copy this error. Actually this is for success and this should be for error. So I will copy this error one, and here I will just paste it. And if it is success, that means if we go to the API response, then I will just add success, and this will be success status, success message, status code will be success, and we have to pass the data as well. So in the data we have to pass the login response. So I will pass login response. Okay, this is done. For the exception, I'll just copy these two lines and I will add it here. This is done. Now I'll come to the Postman again. I will resubmit this API request, and here we got the success message. Let's check this pretty. Yes, we received the status as success, request processed successfully, and in the data we are getting the email and that API token, right? Let's wrap this line. Yes, we have the token generated using the passport authentication. If we'll try to click on login again, this will regenerate this API token. Okay, the token has been changed now. And if we'll try to submit using the invalid credential, then this has thrown the error as unable to process the request, please try again. But for this error message, we have to change the message as invalid credentials. So let's update the message inside the base controller. So I will add public const invalid credentials. I will add the message as unable to process the login request due to invalid credentials. Okay, let's copy this and let's call it from this controller. So for the error, I will change the message as invalid credentials. I will check now. Yes, the message has been updated as unable to process the login request due to invalid credentials. So this is the correct message now. Now based on this authenticated request token, we have to get the user data. So I will be creating one more API and function. So let's come to the code editor again. Here we have the register login, and I will create one more as user profile. Now for accessing the user profile data, we need the API token. So based on the API token, Laravel Passport will authenticate that user, and based on that API token, this will fetch the authenticated user data. Okay. Function user profile. Inside this, I will add try and catch block. Now inside this try block, again I'll call the auth service class. So I will write $this auth service, and I will call one more function as user profile. I'll copy this function. I'll come to the auth service, and here I will define this function, public function user profile. For getting the user profile data, firstly we have to check if user is authenticated or not. So here I'll check auth user simply, and simply we can return it. Now I'll come to the controller again, and I'll capture this response as auth user, and let's copy these two lines again and let's add it here. If not authenticated user, then it will return, and we'll have to change the message. So I'll define one more message as public const user not found, and I will add a message as user request not found. So I'll copy this message and I'll add it here, and for the success I will return the auth user data here. For the exception, again I'll copy these two lines. I will add it here while fetching user. Okay, this is done. Now let's define this endpoint inside the api.php. But for defining this endpoint, we need to keep this inside middleware. Firstly, I will add route : get profile. Function name is user profile, and name will be profile. Okay, and next we will create middleware. So I will create route : middleware, and inside this middleware I will pass the middleware name just like auth API. So we already have this auth API middleware passed here, and I will use group function because we will have to create multiple routes inside the auth middleware, and I will just move the current route inside this middleware routes. Okay, now let's copy this route endpoint name. Let's come to the postman, and here let's make another request. So I'll simply copy this URL, I will paste it, and I will just try to make get request for this profile. I'll click on send. In the preview, this said route login not defined, because this is not able to detect this route without the API token. Why? Because we have added this route endpoint inside the auth middleware, and currently for making this API request, we are not sending any authentication parameters just like any password or token. So this is not able to detect whether the user is logged in order to access this route endpoint. So I'll come to the headers first. Inside this, I will define one property as accept, and in the value I will accept application/JSON. Now if we'll try to click on send, here this received unauthenticated. That means it is not able to detect the user is logged in. So in order to make this API request, we will have to pass the token, and we will get that token from the login response. So simply we will copy this token. Okay, I'll come to the profile request. In the auth, I will choose the token type as bearer token, and inside the token section I will just paste that token. Now I will click on send, and yes, we can see we are able to fetch the authenticated user data based on the given token. If we try to modify the token data, this will throw again unauthenticated because the token is mismatched now. Okay, so this is how the user authentication is working based on the passport authentication. Now we will create logout API. So I'll come to the code editor, and after this user profile, I will create one more function as logout. This will be logout. Okay, let's copy it from here. I will add it. So for the logout, again we need the API token only. So again I will just create try and catch block. This is a good practice to have try and catch block. So inside the try block, again I will call the auth service, and I will just define one function as user logout. I'll copy this function. I will navigate to the auth service, and here I will define the function user logout. Okay, this is user logout. Inside the function, firstly I will check if user is authenticated. So I will add if user is authenticated, then I will revoke this token. So better I'll just keep in a separate variable, just like user, auth user. So if the auth user is there, then I'll simply revoke that token. So I'll be using token function, and the passport provides revoke function just like this. And here I'll just return true, and if authenticated user data is not there, then I will return false. This will return boolean. I'll come to the controller, and here I'll just capture the response, and based on this I will add one if condition again. If response is there, then I'll return that using this, or better we can just copy and paste these entire lines, and I will change this to if not response, then user not found. And here we don't have to return the data, only message will be fine. And same thing for the exception. I'll copy and I'll paste it here. I will change this message as while log out the user. Now let's define this endpoint inside the api.php again. I'll duplicate this. I will change this to logout, and this will call the logout function, and I will change the name as logout. And again I have kept this route endpoint inside the auth middleware. So while making this API request on this endpoint, again we will have to pass the same authentication token. So I'll copy this endpoint, and I'll just try to access the logout API without token. If we'll click on send, again this will throw route login not defined. So we will have to add the header as accept application/JSON, and this said unauthenticated. Now let's copy that token from here, and let's try to pass inside the auth type bearer, and let's paste it here. Now let's try to click on send, Yes, the request processed successfully. Or we can change the message as logged out successfully, logged out successfully. Let's update this here. Now again, if we'll try to log out the same user based on that existing token, this thrown error as user is unauthenticated now, because that token has been revoked for that user. So for making this API request again, we will have to generate the token. Yes, so on the login, again we have a new token here. So now based on this token, we will be able to make the further API request. So we will have to change this here. Yes, we are getting that user data, and for this logout as well. So by using this way, we can create and manage REST API in Laravel using the Passport authentication. We now have a fully functional API secured with Laravel Passport, and we have covered a lot in this video. Now we will talk about the best practices for API security. To ensure the API security, you will have to take care of one thing, that always use HTTPS rather than HTTP. You can limit the token lifespan so that every token will get expired in a limited time span. And the properly handling authentication errors prevents security vulnerabilities and improves API readability. So you will have to take care of these things. So we have covered a lot in this video. Let's quickly recap. We have covered what is Laravel Passport and Authentication, how OAuth 2.0 works. We saw the differences between Passport versus Sanctum. We set up the Passport in Laravel 11, and we secured the API routes using the middleware. So similarly, you can create other functionalities like to-do application. So with the Passport, you can now secure your Laravel API just like a pro. So if you found this video helpful, don't forget to like, subscribe and hit the bell icon for more Laravel tutorials. Also check out the video description for all the code snippets and additional resources. So thanks for watching. See you soon in the next video. Until then, happy coding.